Welcome to this week's episode of Conundrums. This week we'll be talking with Kathleen Martin. She's the author of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill Experience, and Science Was Wrong. She co-authored those with Stanton Friedman. Kathleen is our guest this week. She'll join us in just a few moments on Conundrums. We're talking with Kathleen Martin. She is the co-author of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, along with Stanton Friedman, and also Science Was Wrong. And I believe she has a new book, or is in a new book, called UFOs and Aliens. We're going to get to that in just a moment, but let's welcome Kathleen to the show tonight. Kathleen, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Well, you've been very busy this year, haven't you?
I have been very, very busy. I'm working full-time doing this. More than full-time, actually.
And, well, what are some of the things that you've got going on this year?
Well, I have recently been appointed by the Mutual UFO Network to serve as its abduction research specialist. And so that requires a great deal of my time, developing new protocols for abduction investigation. Also, Denise Stoner and Denise, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she is Florida MUFON's chief investigator, very knowledgeable about abductions, and she and I are collaborating on a book together. I always like to have a co-author when I write a book because I'm a really social person, and I love to bounce ideas off from other people and make it really a fun social process rather than just sitting alone in my office doing it by myself. Denise and I have also written 2 questionnaires, one for UFO abduction experiencers. It's a general 46-question questionnaire about demographics, different characteristics of people, commonalities among people who have been abducted. And I also developed another one by myself. It has 16 questions, kind of open-ended, to obtain more information about ET technology, which is quite interesting.
The book that you're writing together, is that the UFOs and Aliens, or is this a new book?
This is a new book. This is on UFO abductions, and we're going to present 2 case histories, in-depth case histories.
Do you have a title for it yet?
Not really.
It's still a work in progress.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, now, you're the niece of Betty Hill, right?
Yes, I am.
So that puts you very, very close to the Betty Hill story. For our viewers who don't know, can you give us just a brief recap of what is the Betty and Barney Hill story?
Okay. On September 19, 1961, my aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, were returning home from a brief vacation to Niagara Falls, Montreal, and they were traveling through upstate New Hampshire during the nighttime, returning to their home on the seacoast in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. A hurricane was coming up the coast, so they decided to drive during the night. My uncle worked nights anyway. He was on the graveyard shift at the Boston Post Office. My aunt was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, and that's why they took a vacation. She had a week off, and he had asked for a few days off. So as they're driving through upstate New Hampshire, it's a bright, starry night. My aunt is gazing up at the sky when she sees a new light in the sky. And what attracted her attention initially is that instead of traveling the way we would think of a falling star going through the air, it shot upward, and then it stopped. And she watched it as it grew larger and larger in the sky. And because she had never seen a satellite before, she wondered, is that how a satellite moves through the sky? She was thinking about what it might be as it just grew larger and larger. And she finally convinced my uncle to pull over to the side of the road at a picnic area, get out of the car and take a look at it. And they did. By that time, it had come in fairly close. My uncle could see the windows in it before he got into the car again. Initially, she watched it travel across the face of the moon. And as they drove south on U.S. Highway 3 through upstate New Hampshire, they entered an area called Franconia Notch. And this is a very scenic tourist area through the White Mountains. When they entered the notch, the UFO traveled over the top of Cannon Mountain. There's an aerial tramway there. And when it passed over the top, the light, either in the restaurant or in a tower up there, blinked out. And it was a steady burning light. They decided to stop again at the Old Man of the Mountain. And they got out of the car for another look. By now, the craft was an estimated maybe 1,000 feet away from them at its closest approach. Now, it was hovering at this point, too, beside the old man's profile, and that gave them a gauge on how large it actually was, because the profile was 48 feet from forehead to chin, and the craft was at least 1.5 times the length of the profile. It appeared to be rotating at that point. They got back into the car, noting its unconventional nature, the fact that it was completely silent, and they headed south, slowing down, stopping in the road, not getting out of the car, just to take a glance at it. Now, as they exited Franconia Notch at an area called Indian Head, my aunt was becoming excited because it was coming in really, really close to their vehicle. Right. My uncle was looking for a place to pull over to the side of the road, but before he could find a place, the craft shifted ahead and stopped right over their car, and just to the right of it. It descended to within 100 to 200 feet from their car. My uncle took the binoculars, he got out, he looked up at it. He saw a huge disc-shaped craft, completely silent, hovering in the sky above him. There was a lighted row of windows, and as he stepped away from the car, the craft shifted again over an adjacent field just to his left, which would have been to his east, to the east. He walked into the field with the binoculars and looked up. And at that point, it had descended lower, and he observed what he initially described in the very beginning reports as entities that were somehow, quote, not human. That's an established fact. It's in those early reports. All but one then moved in unison away from the row of windows to what appeared to be a panel on the back of this hallway that encircled the front section of the craft. When they did, and their arms went up, the craft tipped toward Barney. It tilted toward him and appeared to be descending. Something was dropping out of the bottom of the craft, and a couple of red lights were coming out of the sides of it. And this frightened him greatly, and he finally tore the binoculars away from his eyes, ran back to the car, screaming to my aunt that they had to get out of there or they were going to be abducted.
Right.
He hopped in, put his foot on the accelerator, and went speeding down Route 3, looking for a police officer. That's what he intended to do. He told my aunt to look up, roll down the window and look up, because he saw the craft change location and shift over the top of the car as he was getting in. She looked up, expecting to see the lights, She didn't see the lights of the craft. She didn't see the stars in the sky. All she saw was blackness. And then she and my uncle heard a series of code-like beeping or buzzing sounds that seemed to be bouncing off the trunk of the car. At that point, a vibration passed through the car and a tingling sensation passed through their bodies. She was really a curious person, and I'm positive she would have wanted to know what Barney saw in that field.
Right.
But she didn't ask. They didn't say a word to each other. And they had very little memory of what happened over the next 35 miles of road. When they were suddenly shaken awake again, you might say, by a second series of these beeping or buzzing sounds. Then they started talking again, they drove home, and they found evidence that was very, very perplexing and couldn't be explained in prosaic terms.
And it's the time period between the beeping sounds that was revealed later in hypnosis, under hypnosis, from Betty and from both Betty and Barney Hill, of what occurred during that, and that's the actual abduction.
Yes.
Who conducted the hypnosis on them?
Dr. Benjamin Simon did the hypnosis.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the leading psychiatrists in the United States at that time. He was in Who's Who in America. He had taught at Harvard, lectured at Yale, and at a number of other prestigious colleges. During World War II, he had served in the Army, had won awards for his service. He served as the chief of neuropsychiatry at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island, treating victims of shell shock and conversion hysteria. And that is when a soldier comes home and maybe they're blind or maybe they're unable to walk, but there's no physiological basis for that. He successfully treated them for the trauma that they suffered and the amnesia that they suffered about that trauma during the war. And that is why Barney was initially referred to him. It was because of the trauma that he was experiencing and his amnesia.
Also, of course, today there's a lot of controversy on hypnosis. At that time, was hypnosis commonly used to treat patients?
I don't think that it was commonly used to treat psychiatric patients, but it was a specialty of Dr. Simon's. He used deep trance hypnosis and used it very effectively. Mm-hmm. He was a psychotherapist and a psychoanalyst.
And what was his conclusions after interviewing both Betty and Barney Hill?
He believed in their truthfulness. Mm-hmm. He realized that Betty and Barney, under hypnosis, had told essentially the same story, even though they had not discussed this. They didn't have prior knowledge of each other's experience on board that craft. Mm-hmm. Betty had 5 dreams and has always thrown question into the validity of what they recalled under hypnosis. That's why I actually did a comparative analysis of Betty's and Barney's statements in hypnosis in order to determine for myself whether or not this was a real event or whether or not Betty had merely relived her dreams in hypnosis and that Barney had somehow absorbed this information and confabulated a story of his own. What I found is that Betty and Barney had told a story that was consistent, but was inconsistent with some of the information in Betty's dreams. And I wrote about that in the book, and I've written about that on my website as well. So readers or listeners can go there and read what I've written about my comparative analysis there. Dr. Simon's conclusion was, wait and see. Mm-hmm. Anything is possible, but only science will be able to give us a definitive answer about whether or not you have been hypnotized. Because after the Condon report came out, and of course anyone familiar with that knows what a sham it was, but Dr. Simon didn't. And in 1975, he made the statement that he, considering all things, either as a psychiatrist, he had to come out and tell the world that a couple from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that he treated had actually been abducted by aliens, or he had to come up with another viable explanation.
Right.
And he decided that he simply could not say that they were abducted because no one else had been, and because science had no proof of in any way that they had been.
Now, you would have been very young at that point. At what point did you become interested in your aunt's experiences and started to, I guess, collect information to study it yourself?
All, let me say I was 13 years old in 1961. When The Interrupted Journey was written in 1966, I had already graduated from high school when it was released. So I was very interested early on. When Betty and Barney were permitted by Dr. Simon to remember what they had stated under hypnosis and to listen to it, they would stop by my childhood home on their way home from Boston, and I would listen to them tell the family what they had recalled. So I was in on this very, very early, but it wasn't until 1990 that I actually decided to do my own investigation on the case. I'd been hearing a lot of what I thought was misinformation. It certainly wasn't consistent with what I remembered about the case. And I wanted to set the record straight. I wanted to separate fact from fiction and write a book to let the public know what was true and what was false.
What was some of the misinformation that you were hearing at that time?
One thing that I read and heard on television, and Phil Klass was the first one to perpetrate this myth, this falsehood, was that Betty and Barney had only seen a light in the sky, and that they didn't realize they had missing time or anything else until Betty had dreams, and that all of this had a very logical explanation. And that's completely false. I mean, it's in the earliest reports that they had a very close encounter with a large, hovering, silent craft, and that Barney had observed beings on board that craft that he described as being non-human. It's in the original reports. It's undeniable.
Absolutely. As you were growing up with your aunt there, did she often just talk about this, and what kind of things would she talk with the family about?
Well, first, she was extremely curious about what happened. Of course, the dress that she was wearing that night was in perfectly fine condition when she put it on the morning of September 19th. When she took it off on the morning of September 20th, there was a 2-inch tear in the top of the zipper at the back of her dress. There was a 1-inch tear on the other side in the fabric itself. It was torn from waist to hemline in the lining, and the hem was torn down on one side. There was no prosaic explanation for what happened to this dress. So that was very perplexing. That
dress still exists, right? It's been analyzed.
Yes, the dress is being preserved in an archival collection at the University of New Hampshire. I have recently given more fabric samples, hoping that someday we'll be able to identify what the pink powder is that grew on that dress. That is very perplexing. Phyllis Budinger did, analytical chemist, did the most complete analysis, but no one has been able to identify what that pink powder is.
And this is also a case that has a lot of physical evidence as well. There was, what was it, magnetism on the back of the car, some scuff marks on his shoes, the dress itself. How much of that has been preserved?
No one ever bothered or thought of taking a photograph of the spots on the trunk of the vehicle, which is really very disappointing because it would have been excellent evidence. I actually saw those spots and recently underwent hypnosis in order to go back to that time to remember exactly what I saw. Just quite interesting. I had always thought that they were simply scattered about the trunk of the car. But under hypnosis, unless I was confabulating, they were more in a triangular pattern, which is quite interesting. All the same size, concentric circles, highly polished. They made the compass needle whirl when the compass was placed over them and drop down when it was taken away. So that was very interesting. Barney's shoes were discarded by Betty after many years. She said that no one had shown any interest in those shoes for years. He had worn them for yard work after that. They had been his dress shoes, but they were so badly scraped on the toes that he could no longer wear them for that. So for many years he wore them just for yard work, so they were ruined anyway.
Yeah. Betty Hill made a comment once years ago that she did not think that the aliens that abducted her were the Greys. Did she ever mention anything like that to you?
Well, let me explain that. She said that they were more like people. They were gray. They met the physical description of the taller Greys, the examiner and the leader. They did the same things that we know that taller Greys do. And I'm talking about the 4.5 to 5 feet tall ones, not the 6 foot tall insect-like ones.
Okay.
But the examiner stood by her head with abductees case after case after case. And it was the leader. The leader stands by the head, I call it the escort, and calms the person. If the person is upset, if the person experiences pain, that being is there to comfort that person. That's exactly what happened with Betty. He had the same physical characteristics that are described today in terms of gray, 5 foot tall entities. The examiner did as well. She saw only one of the 3.5 foot tall beings.
Okay.
And her description of that one was slightly different than the stereotypic image that we have of the small Greys. But its function was the same. They serve as guards. You know, they're sort of the policemen of the craft. And it stood out in the hallway, and it is the one who made such a commotion when he noticed that Betty was attempting to leave the craft with that sort of a book with alien symbols in it.
They had promised to give her something and then took it away, right?
Yes, yes. It was the one she called the leader, who told her that she could take it with her as evidence that her experience had really happened. And then it was taken away after this small guard noticed that she had it.
Did she describe them as wearing any kind of clothing?
Yes. They were all wearing black, shiny, tight-fitting sort of bodysuits. Barney described that in his first reports, that they were wearing black, shiny uniforms. Okay.
Well, let me ask you also this. Have you had a personal UFO encounter yourself?
Yes, I have.
So tell us about it.
I wrote about it in Captured. This is my book, Captured. It is the encounter that I had with several family members on Country Pond, which was very close to my childhood home in South Kingston, New Hampshire. We had gone out to Country Pond after one of my neighborhood friends had observed a UFO, had a close encounter with UFO as she was walking home. And my aunt came down to investigate it, and we thought we would just go out and we would look, and lo and behold, there it was, hovering down in sort of a little area, that's sort of depressed area, and it was there. It was just glowing, kind of a lime green color, and it was almost like it was lying in wait for my friend who would walk home every Wednesday night.
How big was it?
How big was it?
Yeah,
I'd say it was probably 35 feet.
Wow! And you said you saw this with your aunt, so you saw it with Betty.
I was with Betty, my mother, my brother, my grandmother, and my friend. We followed it. It rose up, and we followed it to Country Pond. When we arrived there, it was hovering over the ice. It was February of the year. It moved in front of us, stopped at treetop level near us. Then we went out onto the ice to look at it. It then moved to the other side of the lake. We got back into the car. We followed it. It met up with another one, and we didn't know what happened. It was like they shut their lights off or something. I don't know. We were looking and looking. Everyone except for my mother was looking in one direction, and my mother was looking in the other direction off a bridge that crossed over to an island. And my mother spotted the craft, and what seemed to be almost like a funnel of light came out toward her, but not like a light beam that comes out very quickly. This moved just toward her, and it was almost like a tunnel with solid sides in a way. And that's been reported many, many times since then. And it struck her, and she screamed. We got back into the car and left as rapidly as we could. But then we decided to stop on the other side of the lake and look again to see if we could see it. And at that point, it sort of came over. It ascended into the sky. It descended vertically in sort of a falling leaf pattern, rocking. And then it just shot up and took off, and we went home.
What year was this?
I believe it was 1966.
So this was well after Betty's abduction.
Oh, yes, it absolutely was. We were not interested in UFOs until the abduction. Betty and Barney had never read anything about the topic until then.
Did she have other encounters after the abduction and after this one? Did she see them regularly? UFOs?
She did see them from time to time. She actually engaged with in an experiment. This was a contact experiment with Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson, who were two of the early investigators. They both worked at IBM, and they had actually scripted her to take part in these contact experiments where she was going to attempt to vector in a UFO. And so she would go to her porch every night at a certain time and read this script that she'd like the UFO to show up in a certain location. And one of those locations was actually my grandparents' farm across the street from my house. And lo and behold, while these experiments were taking place, and in fact, I have to tell you, I didn't know about these experiments. They were confidential at the time. But one of our neighbors, who was a commercial pilot, was driving home from work, and he witnessed a UFO coming in for a landing on my grandparents' farm.
Wow.
My grandparents were woken up by it. It sheared off the tops of some trees when it came in. And my brother said that it blew him out of bed, were his words. I don't know if it did or not. He's 5 years younger than I am, so.
And later, I guess after these experiments were over, she told your neighbors she had caused that, or that was what was going on at the time?
You know, I don't even know if she told the neighbors. I doubt that she did, because I only found out about this when I started my investigation. She had never even told me. Anyway. She was keeping it confidential for all of those years. And in the meantime, when this experiment ended, she was conducting her own experiments and drew a lot of negative media attention and attention from the tabloids. People thought that she was nuts because she was saying that UFOs were coming in and she was seeing them at close range. And, you know, sometimes someone would go out with her and she would become excited and misidentify a conventional aircraft as a UFO before she was able to see that it was conventional. Right. But I have cases, and I wrote about it and captured, where there were some very credible witnesses who did see unconventional craft with her.
What were her thoughts on all of this towards the end of her life? As she looked back on her life, can you give us an idea of what she ultimately concluded, what it all was about?
She merely thought that she was one of the first humans ever to have contact with astronauts from another solar system. She thought that the contact was friendly, that she wasn't harmed too badly, because that needle in the navel did cause excruciating pain, but in the long run, she looked at it as a positive experience. She felt that it was an opportunistic abduction, that it was one and only one abduction. And she and my uncle just happened to be in the wrong location for them, but the right location for these ETs, and had shown interest in the ETs by stopping to look at them, and got more than they bargained for.
Exactly. Speaking of location, New Hampshire has placed a marker now. Is it where the abduction happened, or is it located near it?
It's located a mile north of where the abduction happened. The reason that it couldn't be located where the abduction happened is because that is now a housing development. And those people did not want a lot of UFO tourists going on to their quiet little street. We also thought about placing it in the location of the Close Encounter field. And now U.S. Interstate 93 passes right through the center of that field. And so it would tie up traffic going on and off the ramps. We couldn't put it there. Right. So we decided, I and people from the state of New Hampshire, that it should go up by the Indian Head Resort. And they were very happy to have it there. And Indian Head is right across the street. So it now sits on the property of the Indian Head Resort.
Did you spearhead this project to get that monument there?
It wasn't my idea initially. It was the idea of another man from the state of New Hampshire who wrote to me and who had started a petition for this and had gone to the state agency. And that is when the state requested information. They needed verification of everything. Right. And so I was the one who had written the book. I was the one who had the files. I had to provide them with, I think it was something like 35 references. I had to footnote every single statement that I wanted to have placed on that historical marker. And so I became involved in it that way.
For years, the Betty and Barney Hill weren't sure exactly where the location was. How did they go about finally eliminating any other places, excuse me, and determining where the exact location was for the abduction?
Well, they had initially started to look for the area where they saw the fiery orb in the road silhouetted against some trees. They had always had conscious recall of that and conscious recall of a roadblock. They just didn't know where it was. So they looked for several years for the exact location and couldn't find it until after the hypnosis sessions. And when they were finally able to recall more, they went out and started looking again. And it was almost as if it was automatic in a way. We had been up there on Labor Day weekend of 1965, and were all out in the car for a drive again. And all of a sudden, Barney simply turned onto Millbrook Road. It was still a dirt logging road at that time, and right to that location. They walked right out through that path in the woods to the landing area where they were abducted.
Wow. And, of course, growing up, hearing all of this, you were intrigued when you were young. You started, of course, doing your own research. You now have a presentation that you do called A Conundrum of, nice name, by the way, A Conundrum of Alien Abduction. Tell me about your presentation that you do now.
Oh, I do several, actually. Conundrum is one. And in the Conundrum, I talk about the academic studies that have been done on self-reported alien abductees in order to determine what it is, what kind of personality disorders they might have, psychological aberrations, even there were sociological studies done initially. This was actually a recommendation of the Condon study, and the National Academy of Science seconded the motion and thought that it would make a very good topic for investigation. Let's forget about the physical evidence, everybody. Let's see what's up, what's wrong with these people's heads.
Let's determine how nuts they are, right?
Right.
Right.
So,
we don't care about it. We don't care about the dress. We don't care about the powder on it. We don't care about any physical evidence. Just how nuts are they?
And so this is what I did was a survey of all of the studies that I could find that were done. The first one was published in 1970, just after the Condon Committee and the Science Board came out with that recommendation. So academic studies started to be funded.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing, and I go into all of the details in my presentation, but the interesting thing is that, you hear fantasy proneness mentioned over and over again. Well, the people who meet the criteria for having had a real abduction are no more fantasy prone than the general population.
Right.
Over and over again, we find out that they're perfectly normal people having extraordinary experiences. Well, we have a small percentage, just like in the general population, who do have personality disorders or psychological aberrations.
Well, sure.
But no more so than the general population.
And that reflects on the research.
Yes.
Dreams, and how do you determine between it? A lot of people say, well, you just dreamed it. You just dreamed that you were abducted. How do you determine a dream from an actual event?
Well, there's physical evidence in an actual event a lot of times. So a lot of times you can't tell the difference between a dream and an actual event. If you're sleeping through all of it, you just wake up and there's a memory and there's no physical evidence. How do you know?
Right.
But that's not what happens in a lot of cases. I just had an article published in the MUFON Journal this month, and I believe that it's also on my website, And it's about sleep paralysis.
Yes.
And how to determine whether or not it's sleep paralysis or a real experience. And there are markers that help to identify whether or not this was a real experience. For so many people, they were wide awake when it happened.
Right.
If you've been an abductee for a while, yeah, there's a good chance you're going to receive a telepathic message prior to the abduction, and you might be scared to death and awake in your bedroom, trying to go to sleep but not able to do it because you're anticipating that this might happen to you and you don't want it to. Mm-hmm. Well, then these beings come into your bedroom and very rapidly, whoosh, you're up and out, and you either wake up or become conscious again inside the craft or on the examining table itself. Mm-hmm. You come back sometimes with patterns on your body. You might have burn marks on the back of your neck. You might have a pattern of black and blue marks. You might have needle marks into your joints or into your glands. Mm-hmm. There are markers.
What kind of research have you done with abductees? You sat down with a large group of them like Bud Hopkins. How do you go about working with abductees?
I work with abductees in several different ways. I serve as sort of a support person mm-hmm. for people to talk to. People, abductees or suspected abductees, write to me quite often. Mm-hmm. And they're looking for support, they're looking for understanding, and I will talk to them. Sometimes I collect evidence from them. And, as they go through an abduction, they have no one to turn to. They have no one that they can trust to talk to who won't think that they're crazy.
Right.
And so I help them in order to accept what's happening to them, to understand it, and to collect physical evidence about it as well. Another way that I work with people as a MUFON abduction investigator. Mm-hmm. So I do formal abduction investigations. I'm sorry. Also a researcher, mm-hmm. and I've recently, with Denise Stoner, been working on this questionnaire that has put us in touch with a great many abductees who have shared their experiences, and we're establishing commonalities among abductees.
Your previous experience as a social worker, does this help you when you're working with abductees?
Absolutely.
How does it help?
I don't feel that I would be qualified to do it mm-hmm. without my background in a mental health field.
What are some of the things that you said you had a questionnaire for abductees? Do you visit them? Do they visit you? Do you have monthly meetings?
No, actually, the questionnaire is on my website, mm-hmm. And at www.Kathleen with a K mm-hmm. -Marden MARDEN.com. You can go there. I have them right here. One is the UFO abduction experiencer questionnaire, mm-hmm. and it has 45 questions. I ask people to fill it out and to give as much detail as they can. There's also a disclaimer on there, written information about the questionnaires, that I'm not forcing anyone to fill them out. If you feel that you're going to be emotionally distressed by doing this, please don't do it, mm-hmm. etc. Then I have the Abduction Experiencer ET Technology Questionnaire. That's only for people who have pretty full recall mm-hmm. of their experiences on board the craft. And then I have another questionnaire for people who believe they have never been abducted. This is sort of the control group, because I want to know that what these experiencers are reporting to me aren't just common across the population. Mm-hmm. I want to know that it's just common among abductees. And I've got some pretty interesting information here. One of my questions was on chronic fatigue syndrome. And I asked only if they had been formally diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic or reactivating mononucleosis.
Okay.
41% of the respondents answered that they had a formal diagnosis. 0.03% of the general population has a formal diagnosis of those diseases. It's all one disease, actually, called by two different names. 2.5% of the general population has those symptoms. But 41% of the people who responded to this questionnaire.
What does this tell you?
Amazing.
What does this tell you?
This tells me that I think that the extraction of hormones, extraction of glandular tissue has something to do with that.
Well, that raises another question. What do you think is the purpose of abductions? Why are people being abducted?
It's a very good question. I have a speculation. No, of course, nobody knows for sure what the answer to that question is. We know that they're extracting DNA from people, either reproductive material or extracting samples from different areas of the body. It might be internal organs. It might be synovial fluid from joints. I hear report after report of long, thin instruments being inserted into the joints. Also needles, as I said, being inserted into glands and into perhaps internal organs. Still reports of needles being inserted into the area of the navel that are connected to a tube. What are they doing with it? Well, David Jacobs has done a pretty good job of informing us that hybrids are being grown in a medium on board these motherships in domed tubes, large dome tubes. They generally aren't attached to a placenta. It's whatever this medium is nourishing the fetus, and the fetus seems to be breathing it in as it grows. There are early, medium, and late stage, or middle and late stage hybrids reported by these abductees that David has hypnotized, and other well-known hypnotists as well, hypnotherapists.
Do you think that the aliens are a threat to us?
Well, they certainly are violating medical ethics. They haven't asked permission to do any of this tissue sampling from any of us. Are they helping us? Well, some people state that they have been cured of diseases. Barbara Lamb, for example, talks about some of her clients who have been cured of things like cancer. Stan Romanek reported that he received a knee operation on board the craft and could walk perfectly fine, didn't need the operation that he was scheduled to have. There have been reports that women who had been unable to have children have successfully had children with the help of these ETs. But I've also received reports from people like one person, a woman who was not engaging in sexual relations. She was celibate, had been for a long period of time, but developed a venereal disease after an abduction. A case of another woman whose vagina was perforated during an abduction experience. So we seem to have the good and the bad.
Yeah. And, of course, Betty went through a pregnancy test where they inserted the needle in her navel and took a fluid out.
That's what, well, she didn't say they took a fluid out. She said that they inserted the needle into her navel and said that it was some kind of pregnancy test. And she said, it's no pregnancy test on this planet, don't do it. And, of course, he did it anyway. He plunged the needle into her navel, and it was extremely painful and distressing for her. Dr. Simon had to end that hypnosis session early because she was so traumatized by the event. Did they take over from her? Good chance of it. That's what they're doing to other people today, apparently.
You mentioned the tapes. Do the tapes still exist today?
Yes.
Do you have them?
Yes, I do.
Okay. All right. Just making sure that we still have that information.
Yes, I am the trustee of Betty's estate. I have co-ownership with Dr. Simon's estate.
Mm-hmm. So all of the things that she collected after this, you own them now. The bust of the alien that she had done, I think.
I donated that to the archival collection at the University of New Hampshire, along with a lot of her files, but I have retained a copy of all of her files and more that I have added to it with my own research.
And she had books? Did she have a lot of books on the subject?
Yes, she did have a lot of books. The University of New Hampshire has some. I have the ones that she gave to me, and I also donated some to the Mutual UFO Network.
Okay. Speaking of books, movies, films, your book is going to be made into a film, correct?
Yes, it is.
It's called Shades of Grey. How's that project moving along?
Well, we have a signed, executed contract now. That just took place last week. And so Bryce Zabel is gathering thoughts and ideas on how he's going to present this in a screenplay. There's so much information, he sort of has to narrow it down, but we're really very excited about all of this. And so it's going to come together, and I'll be working with Bryce on this, supplying information to him. And Stan will as well.
Like a script advisor?
Yes.
Will you play a part in the movie?
I have no idea. I know that I probably personally won't play a part in the movie, but I suspect that I will be written into it because the book is told pretty much from my perspective, even though, you know, initially when I wrote it, it was in the first person, and then when I invited Stan to write the chapters on the star map and on disbelievers and disinformants, then I had to change that and put it into the third person.
Right.
But,
did Betty benefit in any way from the movie that was done in the 70s?
Financially?
Yeah, I guess, I guess they paid her for that, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, you are paid when you sell a screenplay and when a movie is developed from it.
Did she ever do conferences? Did she ever speak at conferences?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, she did.
You know, I wasn't aware of that. I've always seen her on, like, documentaries, but I didn't know she actually went and spoke at conferences. I guess none of the... Do any of those exist on tape today?
I do know that her last speech at the MUFON Symposium, I believe it was in 2000 or 2002 in Rochester, New York. I know that was videotaped. I don't know about the earlier ones. I don't have any videotapes of her giving speeches at conferences.
So you have no archives of that?
No, none of that.
Okay, the book is called, the latest book that you have is UFOs and Aliens. You're currently working on a new book. And, of course, there's Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, which you did with Stanton Friedman. Science Was Wrong, which also... What did you contribute to Science Was Wrong?
Well, his Science Was Wrong. And Stan wrote 7 chapters, and I wrote 7 chapters in that book. So it was a 50-50 contribution by each of us. And he contributed a section on aerospace, another section on technology. I wrote the section on medicine, and that includes politics, personalities, and childbed fever. It's about the work of Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna, Austria, back in the 1850s, 1860s. In that time frame, he was a physician at the medical school there, and the person who discovered the cause of childbed fever. And it's about how he was debunked, how he lost his job as a result of this discovery, because the powers that be were not willing to accept the idea that doctors could actually be causing this to happen. Very sad story, but in the end, he was exonerated, but that was after his death, unfortunately. Also have a chapter on the smallpox wars, about the history of smallpox, and the hemophilia Holocaust, about how hemophiliacs were told that there was one chance in a million that they might contract HIV as a result of using their medicine. When in the end, about 90% contracted HIV. Another sad story. We also have a section on politics, and I wrote a chapter on the eugenics movement in America. And that was a really interesting study. I had initially started to learn about that when I was in college in two separate classes. One was in social work. And there was a discussion there on whether or not convicted felons and their sons should be sterilized. Because there was evidence that the sons of convicted felons also ended up being convicted felons, so maybe they shouldn't be able to contribute their DNA to the production of other children. And we talked about this also in my genetics class.
Science is often wrong.
And it, I had never, until I wrote this book, thoroughly investigated the situation. And it's very, very interesting how an idea that is really diabolical can be politicized and promoted in this country and do so much damage, and then be taken overseas to Nazi Germany, who did a far better job at it than we did. So you'll have to read that chapter. It's really something.
Well, speaking of your books, can they buy the books directly from you on your website?
Yes, you can go to my website at www.Kathleen with a K -Marden MARDEN.com, and I will send an autographed copy to you by priority mail. So you can get it quickly that way. It's also available at Amazon and in any bookstore. It's published by a publisher, not self-published.
There you go. And that was going to be my next question. Will you autograph books? And apparently you do.
Absolutely. And I always have them at conferences, too. And you can get a list of the conferences that I'll be speaking at this year when you go onto my website.
And if you get a chance to go to one of those conferences, make sure you do, because Kathleen is an excellent speaker, and there's a lot more information available on the Betty and Barney Hill case and other research that she's doing. Kathleen, thank you so much for being my guest.
It was a pleasure being with you, really. I enjoyed it.
And we'll see you next time on Conundrums.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.
Still a work in progress.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, now you're the niece of Betty Hill, right?
Yes, I am.
So that puts you very, very close to the Betty Hill story. For our viewers who don't know, can you give us just a brief recap of what is the Betty and Barney Hill story?
Okay. On September 19, 1961, my aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, were returning home from a brief vacation to Niagara Falls, Montreal, and they were traveling through upstate New Hampshire during the nighttime, returning to their home on the seacoast in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. A hurricane was coming up the coast, so they decided to drive during the night. My uncle worked nights anyway. He was on the graveyard shift at the Boston Post Office. My aunt was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, and that's why they took a vacation. She had a week off, and he had asked for a few days off. So as they're driving through upstate New Hampshire, it's a bright, starry night. My aunt is gazing up at the sky when she sees a new light.
That in just a moment, but let's welcome Kathleen to the show tonight. Kathleen, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Well, you've been very busy this year, haven't you?
I have been very, very busy. I'm working full-time doing this.
Mm-hmm.
More than full-time, actually.
And, well, what are some of the things that you've got going on this year?
Well, I have recently been appointed by the Mutual UFO Network to serve as its abduction research specialist.
Mm-hmm.
And so that requires a great deal of my time developing new protocols for abduction investigation. Also, Denise Stoner and Denise, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she is Florida MUFON's chief investigator, very knowledgeable about abductions, and she and I are collaborating on a book together. I always like to have a co-author when I write a book because I'm a really social person, and I love to bounce up.
Welcome to this week's episode of Conundrums. This week we'll be talking with Kathleen Martin. She's the author of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill Experience, and Science Was Wrong. She co-authored those with Stanton Friedman. Kathleen is our guest this week. She'll join us in just a few moments on Conundrums. We're talking with Kathleen Martin. She is the co-author of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, along with Stanton Friedman, and also Science Was Wrong. And I believe she has a new book, or is in a new book, called UFOs and Aliens. We're going to get to
in the sky. And what attracted her attention initially is that instead of traveling the way we would think of a falling star going through the air, it shot upward, and then it stopped. And she watched it as it grew larger and larger in the sky. And because she had never seen a satellite before, she wondered, is that how a satellite moves through the sky? She was thinking about what it might be. As it just grew larger and larger, and she finally convinced my uncle to pull over to the side of the road at a picnic area, get out of the car and take a look at it. And they did. By that time, it had come in fairly close. My uncle could see the windows in it before he got into the car again. Initially, she watched it travel across the face of the moon. And as they drove south on U.S. Highway 3 through upstate New Hampshire, they entered an area called Franconia Notch. And this is a very scenic tourist area. Ideas off from other people and make it really a fun social process rather than just sitting alone in my office doing it by myself. Denise and I have also written 2 questionnaires, one for UFO abduction experiencers. It's a general 46-question questionnaire about demographics, different characteristics of people, commonalities among people who have been abducted. And I also developed another one by myself. It has 16 questions, kind of open-ended, to obtain more information about ET technology, which is quite interesting.
The book that you're writing together, is that the UFOs and Aliens, or is this a new book?
This is a new book. This is on UFO abductions, and we're going to present 2 case histories, in-depth case histories.
Do you have a title for it yet?
Not really.